Hello, I'm Jack Baker. In this presentation, I'm going to be speaking about giving technical presentations. I'm going to be a two-part series. In this part, I'm going to talk about general strategies for crafting and organizing your presentation, putting it together. I'll have a companion presentation to discuss in more detail technical figures, which are a critical part of technical presentations. But let's get started with part one. So the idea is I'm assuming the audience here is technical students, engineering students. And certainly your career is going to involve giving technical presentations. Even if you end up leaving your primary academic discipline at some point in your career, or you move into management positions where you're doing less technical work, you'll certainly still present technical material to audiences of various types. And when you give those presentations, the quality of the presentation is not just as important. It certainly depends on the underlying technical quality of the work you've done. But if you do a good job with the presentation, the audience is going to benefit much more from this presentation. They're going to understand what you're saying. You're going to appear credible. You're going to be more persuasive. And conversely, a bad presentation, if you don't structure things, if you don't structure things carefully, if you don't make your message clear to your audience, or if just the general quality is low, either the audience won't understand what you're trying to make, at what point you're trying to make, they won't be persuaded by your argument, or they just won't perceive you as credible because of the low quality of the work that they're seeing. And so, with that in mind, it's really critical to have an understanding of good strategies for giving effective technical presentations. And a message that I'll hit a couple times is that it's not hard to do a good job here. These are relatively simple tips. I'm going to give you kind of the basics here. There's obviously lots more that could be done and lots more advanced concepts. But just with these simple tips, I think you can greatly improve the quality of your presentations compared to kind of just going off of intuition or your gut feel. So let's get started. I've got a couple main topics for this presentation. So number one is going to be how to construct your presentation, how to set up the scope and the structure of the presentation. We'll talk a little bit about practical tips on putting together slides. We almost always present with visual slides in technical presentations such as this one. And then as I noted, I'll have a companion presentation where I discuss figures in more detail. Okay. So let's get into constructing the presentation, and let's talk about this briefly at the start here. This is not a great slide visually, but it just serves to kind of lay out the scope of what I want to talk about today. So when I'm putting together a presentation, I use these following 5 steps. So the first thing I need to do is I need to think about my audience. So when I know I've got a presentation coming up, I want to understand who is that audience. Is it students? Is it professionals? Is it people who have expertise in my area of work? Or is it a more broad audience? Is it the public? And then I want to think also about what are the messages that I want to leave them. And so if I don't have a sense of like what the message is that I want the audience to get from me, I'm sunk from the beginning. I'm not going to be able to put together an effective presentation. Okay. So once I know my messages and my audience, then I'm going to make my conclusions. Okay. So that's kind of all at the beginning. It's just what am I trying to get across, for this audience. Once I've got those conclusions in place, then I can start thinking about results. Okay, so step 2 is going to be my results slides. And generally let's get into that details later. Okay, once I've got my results put together, then I can start thinking about background. So, I've got my audience identified, and then I can think through, what kind of background are they going to need? And we'll talk through some details of that. At that point, I'll have kind of a rough draft of a presentation ready with conclusions and results and background. And then I'm going to practice giving it. And so usually I will just do that myself a little bit. I might go through it quickly in my own office, or I might kind of speak through the whole thing in the amount of time that I have allotted. Refine a little bit, because usually when I try to give it, I'll realize there's some holes or some transitions that are clunky or things like that. Once I've refined it a little bit myself, then I want to practice giving it to real people. And so with a real audience, and I want to make sure that I've got an audience that's going to give me real feedback and not just nod politely and say it looks good. Okay, so at this point, that we'll get into more details on these things in just a minute, but at this point, you want to have kind of this big picture structure in mind. And one thing to notice here is that the audience is really primary in a lot of this planning. Steps 1 and step 5, the starting and conclusion, are really thinking about the people in the audience and then getting some people in an audience. And then also steps 1, 2, 3, this is kind of working backwards from the order in which you're going to give this material, right? So you'll start with kind of background, then you'll present results, and you'll finish with conclusions in the presentation. But when you're assembling your presentation, you want to work backwards from that. If you don't have that conclusion in mind, it's very hard to put together the rest of it, right? It's kind of like thinking about where the finish line is in a race. And if you don't know where the finish line is, you can run as fast as you want or as good as you want, but if you don't know where you're trying to get to, you're not going to win that race. So you always want to kind of keep the finish line in mind. And so starting with that conclusion section is really important, I think, in being efficient and being effective in structuring your presentation. Okay, so let's talk some more details about these individual steps. So thinking about the audience and thinking about the conclusions. So I think it's wise to start by thinking about kind of some key questions, right? And a couple ways to think about this. That first sentence says, if you want that audience member to leave remembering 2 or 3 things from your presentation, what would you want them to remember? Right? And it's really a pretty small number of things that they're going to remember. They're not going to remember all of the details. The details you're presenting are going to provide support for those main 2 or 3 things you want them to remember. And maybe it's going to get them interested enough that if they're really passionate about what they've heard from you, they'll follow up and try to understand those details in greater depth. When you're trying to think about those 2 to 3 key things, some questions are, to think through, can you convey to the audience what topic are you studying, which is what's the general problem you're trying to solve? Number 2, what was your approach, right? How did you go about trying to solve this? Are you doing computational calculations? Are you doing experiments? Are you doing surveys? What's the strategy you're using to try to solve that problem or address that topic? And then 3, what did you find, right? That's the kind of natural one. That, what did you conclude from this work? And so I think you certainly want to convey that, but you also want to make sure that the audience understands, what is the topic you're studying and what was your approach. Don't overestimate the possibility that they could miss that if you don't highlight it. And so you want to make sure you communicate those ideas. Okay, so once you've got that, those kind of key points in mind, you can go start creating results. And I think this is the part that a lot of technical people are really the most comfortable with, right? You did a whole bunch of work, you've got a whole bunch of results, and so you want to put that down. And so hopefully that's not too difficult, and you should feel confident that you've got results after the work you've done. A thing that a lot of people struggle with here, I think, is that they want to present everything that they've worked on, right? And you want to show all these kind of interesting side calculations you did, but they may not be relevant to your conclusions, right? And if they're not relevant to your conclusions, your audience is going to struggle to figure out, like, why am I hearing this? Why is this part important? And if you keep focused on the most important parts, that the audience will help. They will understand that as well. And so this second line here is just say stay focused on that conclusions, and you'll have a lot of material that's called interesting but irrelevant. Right? It's interesting, so don't say that leaving it out means that it was a waste of time or that it was a bad idea for you to have done that. It's just not relevant to the conclusions you're trying to present today. Okay, and so you can still feel good about those results, and you don't have to put them in the trash, but they don't need to be in your presentation just because you found them interesting. Another thing that happens sometimes at this stage is that you'll realize there's a gap in your analysis. Right, you'll have some conclusion you're trying to head towards, and then you realize you don't quite have the results to support that conclusion yet. And here I think the process of putting together a presentation is really part of the exercise of doing scholarship, and that you may convince yourself that you've got everything sorted out, but it's not until you kind of write down the details and write down a logical structure of thinking here in this results section that you realize problem. And that's okay. Just to go back and resolve the gap and either include the extra results that you needed to make your argument, or revise your conclusions if you realize that there was a shortcoming in your initial draft. Here, I would say figures are really an important way to be providing results. They're visual, which is great for a visual medium like a presentation. They can be really rich with information. And so I generally rely pretty heavily on figures in technical presentations. As I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit more about how to put together figures in a companion presentation. At this stage, at this big picture stage, when I'm putting together a presentation, I tend to start from the graphics and start from the figures, and then fill in kind of other elements around it, fill in text or equations or things as needed. But the figures are really a nice way to tell a story, and so I like to start with that when I'm putting together the results. Okay, when you're putting together these results, you got to have that audience in mind. So I put it in boldface here, and I say fixate. Fixate on your audience. If you're doing any work at this stage that's not thinking about your audience, you're taking a big risk that you're not going to connect with your audience, right? And the whole point of a presentation is that there's that audience that's learning information from you. They're being persuaded about something, and to put together technical presentations focused on your own interests or your own part that you feel excited about is just not productive, and it's not respecting the people in the room, and it's not respecting this process that this is a two-way communication. and that a failure for the audience to understand what you're doing is a failure on your part as well as theirs. So keep that audience really front and center in your mind. Some things to be thinking about here are, what background do they have? Is this an audience that's primed to really understand the details of the work you did, or is it a more general audience that's going to need some more they need to be motivated to understand what you're doing, right? You've probably got some key analysis techniques you're using, or some key assumptions. Is that going to be obvious to this audience, or do you need to kind of point that out to them? And here I think it's one thing to say, oh, my audience is, practicing engineers, but it's another thing to put a name. And I like to think about kind of visualizing a specific person. All right, so you might think about, would my office mate Steve, would he understand what I'm saying here? What would he come in assuming about this technique or this assumption? Or my supervisor Jane, is she going to understand what I'm saying here, or do I need to kind of put in a couple extra results here to help get her to this conclusion that I'm trying to draw here? And so I think the more you can have a specific name and a specific face of a person, or more than one person in mind, that'll help you really take advantage of this idea of empathy with the audience. Another question is, your audience is going to be more than one person almost certainly. And so how varied are their backgrounds? It's not uncommon that you have an audience of people where some of them are relatively novice, or they're maybe expert in a different field than yours. And then there's some other people in the room that are really expert in your work and know the details. And so balancing that is a little bit tricky. I'd say, generally my strategy with a varied audience background is to make sure that everybody in the audience leaves with something useful, right? So the people with the background very different from yours, the thing they might leave useful, or might leave with that's useful, is an understanding of some techniques, or an understanding of why the approach you're taking to this problem is interesting, even if they don't fully appreciate the details of what you were doing. There are some other people in the audience that might be much more expert. You don't want them to be bored because you've only given kind of general overview to that more lay audience. So you want to include some details in there for them, and so that they can leave saying, okay, yeah, I appreciate that they were, that you as a speaker were helping along some of the novices in the room, but also, the experts leave with enough information to feel like you're really credibly doing good work in this area. And I think you find that if you've got some work, some results that are appropriate for that lay audience and some results that are appropriate for the expert audience, they'll all be patient with you in the other parts of the presentation. So if I'm an expert listening to another expert, and the presenter takes a couple minutes to provide some background that I already knew, I'm more than happy to sit there and listen to that for a little bit. I appreciate that the presenter is trying to reach everybody in the audience and not just me. And generally, I'll respect that they're trying to, explain what they're doing, and I can evaluate as well. Are they doing a good job of explaining to a lay audience what they're doing, or are they, kind of being misleading? So it's still an interesting and productive part of the presentation. And certainly, a lay person in the audience that knows there's other experts in the room, they're going to understand that, yeah, not every slide am I going to perfectly comprehend, but let me get away, some high level take messages here, and I'll hang tight for a couple minutes if there's something that goes a little over my head. So that's usually how I try to handle that. The final bullet point here on this slide about your audience is you want to think about, is this audience already excited about your topic, or do you need to get them interested, right? So sometimes you'll be, presenting at a technical conference and it's a special session on, exactly the work that you're doing. And there's, 5 or 6 presentations that are all on that same topic. Presumably everybody in the room is interested in that topic, and you don't have to kind of convince them that this is an interesting thing. There are other times where you're speaking to a more general audience. Maybe there's some broad technical session at a conference or in a class or something like that, and people are presenting on all sorts of different topics. In that case, you might say, do I need some results in here just to even get them interested in this topic, to make sure they feel excited about what I'm presenting? And so that's something to keep in mind about your audience. Okay, so at this point, we've got kind of our results put together, and the interesting part of those results. Now I start thinking about background. All right, so we still got my audience in the title here, and we want to think about, what do I need so that this audience can appreciate what I'm doing, and where in the presentation am I going to put it? So again, highlighting, your audience and what do they need to know, right? And so here, this is a question that comes up a lot. A lot of students come in and say, I'm putting together this presentation. How much background should I include? And I think that it's good that they're asking the question, and it really depends on these two factors, right? So who are you talking to? How much do they know already, and how much are they going to have to learn? And then ask yourself, what do they need to learn before they understand kind of the messages you're giving them. There's lots of things you could teach them, but again, you want to keep it focused on really their bare needs, because they're not here to hear background. They're at your presentation to hear, the work that you did. So a couple of thoughts, right? Depending on the audience, that amount of background could vary. A more lay audience is going to tend to need more background, and an expert audience, you might be able to jump right into your results. And then you want to keep it short, right? So you can get to your results and get to the point. Again, think of real people, think of their names when trying to imagine and say, does Steve, does he have enough background to understand these results I'm presenting, or do I need to give a little bit of extra? And a bullet point here is this last sentence. So try to get it into your results slides if at all possible, because you can get it into context, right? What I don't think is a good idea to do is up on slide 3, provide some sort of background equation, and then drop it, present 10 slides of results, and then pull up that equation in slide 14 of your presentation, because your audience isn't going to remember back to slide 3 what that was talking about. If you need some sort of key equation, it doesn't need to be up at the front of the background. Introduce the equation right when you're showing results using it, right? And so I think it's perfectly fine to say, okay, now I'm going to show these results, and here's the process I use. Let me explain for just a moment this process that I used to get the results. Do it right in line with those results. Okay. So if I back up a slide here for a second, in the ordering that I like to think about for this background is, item A, if at all possible, I'm going to put that background right in with my results. I just want to explain the context for what I'm doing right as I show my results. If that doesn't work, maybe it's more broad, or maybe it's just generally I need to motivate the audience to get interested in my topic, something like that. I'll try to get it in like a motivation slides, which is just my first few slides, and we'll get to that in just a second. So there I'm really focusing on trying to get the audience, motivated and interested in my topic. If that doesn't work, then I might consider doing some background slides at the beginning, but that's kind of my third choice. I'd rather do it in a couple other formats if I can. Okay, so let's talk about a motivation slide. And I think I really like to have an explicit motivation slide in my presentation and just tell the audience, what's the motivation for why I'm doing this. You don't have to have it in your presentation, but I think you should formulate it yourself in your own head at a minimum, and say, well, why am I doing this? Why is this topic important? And think about these questions here. What are you doing? What's the question you're trying to solve? What are you asking? And why is that an important question, right? And if the audience can, right at the start of the presentation here, oh yeah, this is an interesting question, I see why this is important, then they're going to hang with you and concentrate on the technical stuff you have to present afterwards, okay? And it's really your chance, I'd say, to hook your audience on what your story is. In the first few slides, I'm sure you've sat through some presentations where the presenter really hooked you with a story right at the beginning. These TED conference presentations are really good at that, right? They're really telling a story, and in the first 60 seconds, you're captivated and can't wait to hear what the speaker has to say next. Conversely, you've probably been at presentations where somebody just jumps in and starts kind of rambling in different directions, and you're not really sure where they're going, and it's very easy to tune out quickly and kind of not give that commitment to the presenter to understand what they're up to. So use your motivation slide to hook your audience. And I'd say those motivation questions are pretty similar to the conclusions questions, right? So a few slides ago, I gave you these 3 questions in the gray box to think about for conclusions. The motivation, I think it'll be, I don't tend to focus on the results and what I found, but I do like to think about, explaining, what's the general area that I'm working on. And so their motivation questions are pretty closely related to the conclusions questions usually. Okay, so I like to, start with a title slide, then straight to motivations. Another thing that sometimes comes up at the start of presentations is an outline slide. So some people like to have and say, here's the outline of my presentation. The thing I would strongly discourage you from doing is giving an outline that follows these 5 bullet points. All right, so I've been to many, many presentations where I say, I'm going to start with the introduction, I'll give you some background, show you my analysis results, then we'll conclude with the conclusions. And to me, that's a waste of time. It's that's the natural structure that you should be putting to a presentation, and it indicates to me that perhaps the audience or the presenter just doesn't have a lot of experience presenting, or they haven't really thought about their audience and thought about is this something that the audience is going to understand inherently, or am I just kind of doing this out of a habit or something like that. The situation where you might think about an outline slide is if you've got a more unusual structure or a more complicated structure. So maybe if you're giving a long presentation and there's going to be several sections to the analysis or the results, you might call out what those sections are. In this presentation, I did something similar to that with my 5 numbered items about the steps of doing a presentation. So that gives me a little bit of a structure to work off of. But I would say just make sure that you're trying to get to the interesting part of the presentation quickly, and make sure that you're only giving some information about an outline if you think it's going to help the audience to follow along with what you're doing. Again, thinking about these TED Talks, so I don't think I've ever seen a TED Talk where somebody gives an outline of their presentation at the start. That's not to say that TED Talks are perfect as a format for technical presentations in every regard, but in that regard, I think that's kind of illustrative that you've probably listened to TED Talks and you've probably enjoyed them, and you probably didn't feel like, oh man, I wish I had an outline slide at the start of that presentation so that I could have understand where the speaker was going. Right? They put together a story that was coherent enough that you followed along with them just fine without this outline slide. Okay, so at that point, we've kind of structured up our presentation, right? We've got our conclusions done, we've plugged in our results, then we sprinkled in the background where it was needed, and only the bare minimum that was needed for our audience. So at this point, we've got kind of a full draft presentation, and we want to practice giving it, right? So I like to, as I said at the start, practice it a little bit internally, refine it, tinker with it, add some more material if I felt like something was a little bit too sparse, or take something out if it just seemed like it was kind of dragging for a bit, or maybe it wasn't helping me get to my point. Once I've refined it a little bit internally, then I'm going to go present it to some real people and get some feedback. And let me double check where I'm at. Okay, so in terms of the real people, it could be one person, it could be 10 people, depends on how many people you can round up and what you think will be productive. And the thing I think here at this point is to really think about the feedback. And the people you're practicing presenting to are going to take cues from you as to what you're wanting out of them. So hopefully you've got some friends or some colleagues that are willing to spend a little time listening to you. And what you really want to impress upon them is that you want their feedback and you want their honest assessment and comments and suggestions for improvement. So you've probably been to presentations where somebody came in and gave their talk, but you didn't, you've sensed that they were really just looking for affirmation that they had done a good job. And then you've probably been to some presentations where people were really probing of like, did you follow that? Was that structured in a good way? Do you have any ideas for other ways I might think about it? And when you start getting that feedback from the audience, I think oftentimes it's productive to kind of give your presentation straight through and then ask questions and start soliciting things. If you're kind of enthusiastic and sincere in receiving the initial feedback, I think you'll find that audience will open up and offer more feedback. If you kind of argue back and say, oh yeah, I see what you're saying, but really I had this good idea and the way I did it was because of this, that's fine. I'm sure you had a good idea for doing it. But if you appear kind of argumentative or dismissive of that feedback, everybody else will climb up and they'll say, okay, well, this presenter seems like they've got it under control, or they seem happy with what they're up to. So I don't need to kind of work hard to kind of give them more assistance. So really try to solicit that feedback, and it's only going to benefit you because they're really indicators of what your true audience is going to be and how they're going to perceive your work. And if everybody's confused by some step of your presentation, even if you thought it was brilliant, if they're confused, they're confused. And you better identify that and address that early. And so that feedback step, I think, is really valuable. And as time passes, as you get better at giving presentations, you'll more quickly anticipate what that feedback might be. But especially as you're kind of early in your career, trying to get as much feedback as you can from as many people as you can is great. And again, some of those people could be experts, some of those people could be your peers that are more novice. Anybody's feedback is going to be valuable at this stage, and you don't have to follow it all. You don't have to, make every change that was suggested, but you want to hear as many data points as you can about how your work has been perceived. Okay, so that's kind of the steps through constructing a presentation. And I think if you follow this process, nothing here is super time-consuming compared to what you would usually do to put together a presentation. Perhaps practicing it and giving feedback is something that some people will cut out of the process to save time. I think it certainly impacts the quality of a presentation if you don't practice it and get some feedback. But the first 3 steps especially, this is all things you're going to have to do anyways. And so going through it in a structured manner is I think, much more efficient than just kind of cobbling up all the figures you have and stacking them in some sort of order without having like a real plan for how the presentation is going to go. So let's talk about some practical things to go along with this presentation. So one real practical issue is the format in which you put together, you lay out your slides. And so here's a few practical things. Again, listed in a bullet point list of text. That's not the most compelling visual story, but I hope it's useful for you as a reference. So let's walk through these. So let's include slide numbers on any presentation you give. So in these slides you've been looking at, I've got numbers up in the top right corner. They don't need to take up a lot of space. They're not very intrusive, but they're really valuable for discussion especially. So when you're given that practice presentation or the real presentation, at the end you'll take some questions, and it's really nice if an audience member can say, on slide 14 you showed this result. Could I ask you a question about that? And it's very easy to just pull back up slide 14 and get there quickly. Conversely, if you don't have those numbers, people will say, can you go back to like the middle part of the presentation? No, go back further. No, too far, go forward. And you're stuck with this kind of going back and forth, or people just won't even try to reference the slide to ask the question, even if the slide would have been useful. So having those numbers is really helpful. In terms of the text, use a font and a size that's very easy to read, even at low resolution, right? You'll sometimes be using a projector that's not great resolution or really bright. You might be in a room where the room is quite deep and there's people far away from the screen. And so you really want to make sure that your font and your size of the font is easy to read. So that means, have a pretty substantially large text. That also applies to any text that you've got on figures or equations or things as well. You don't want to have small fonts that are hard to read. And so, you can do a few different things. You can compare, say, to this presentation where I think the font sizes are pretty reasonable. You can compare your presentation to that. You can put your slide up in your room where you're going to be presenting if you have access to the room. Go to the back of the room and see how easy it is to read. You also want to use fonts without serifs. So serifs are these little extra lines at the edges of characters. They're really effective for the serifs are effective for text in books. So when you have very long lines of text, they help your eye kind of stay on a horizontal line. They're not effective for presentations on like visual presentations like these. So you want to use what's called a sans serif font. Helvetica and Arial, those are very common sans serif fonts. There's lots of other ones as well. But quantitative research has said that sans serif fonts are easier to read. The audience comprehends what you're saying more quickly. And so this third text is an example of a font with serifs, and you can kind of get a sense that it's harder to read up on a projector. All right, in terms of layout, you don't want to get the audience all distracted with frilly stuff that's not contributing to your material. So you want to, I'd say, minimize the number of colors, fonts, font sizes, outline levels, decorations. Just keep a clean presentation. Keep the focus on your material rather than on bells and whistles. I think this has gotten a lot better in the past few years. Kind of design aesthetics have gone to more simple layouts. It used to be that people were really fixated on lots of different outline levels and different colors and different fonts and all sorts of stuff like that. I think that stuff's a mess, and it just distracts the audience. So in this case, you can see these presentations slides. There's kind of two colors. There's a little bit of red here and mostly black. There's a little bit of a colored bar over at the left. This is just a template that Stanford University provides to me, and I think it's reasonable enough. It doesn't hurt to have a little bit of something for visual interest, but you don't want it to detract from the real message. And try to not have lots of different sizes of text and colors and things like that. A question sometimes arises, should I use kind of black text on a white background or white text on a black background or some other scheme? I'd say my default recommendation is to use a white background. If you're presenting in a room with the lights on or that it's not super dark, it's much easier to read black text on a white background than the reverse. I've got the picture of Steve Jobs over at the right, and you've probably been staring at for a while. And so he would present lots of dark slides with white text, and it was quite visually compelling. But he had a built-for-purpose theater where he could control the lighting. He had a very heavy graphics design team that could help put these things together. And so I think it's a slightly different circumstance than most of us are working in. The other thing is if you're going to have any sort of graphics and things like that, and you've got a black background, you're going to need to make sure that the graphic has a black background as well with white text. And that can mean kind of special formatting of your figures or your graphics, or it could mean having separate versions of your figures for the presentation versus the paper that you're preparing. And so it's just easier to use a white background. And then if you have figures with white backgrounds, it's easy to drop them in and have them look good. So, I would say, the Apple product presentations and tech product presentations, they do some very good things in terms of having very readable text and not having lots of distractions and things on the slides. Compared to a technical presentation of a more academic type, I'd say, I would flip to a white background with black text. I would add slide numbers. I'd make a couple adjustments relative to those types of styles. Another practical question that oftentimes comes up is kind of how many slides should I include? How many slides should I use? And so I'd say I start with a few rules of thumb to get started with my presentation length, and then I revise after that. So here's a few rules of thumb. If I'm giving a technical presentation, I'm presenting at a conference or presenting my research in some format, I think about 1 or 2 minutes per slide is appropriate. If you're going faster than that and you're not allowing yourself at least a minute per slide, you're probably rushing through some material, and you may have put things up and moved on before the audience had a chance to comprehend what you were saying. In this presentation, I think I'm going at a much slower pace than that even. But I think be careful about situations where you've got more than 1 slide per minute on a technical presentation. If you've got a photo or a very simple slide or something like that with just kind of 1 word or 1 sentence to kind of make an impact, you could consider using 30 seconds on those slides. But I'd say if any slide goes up and it's not up there for at least 30 seconds, you ask the question if you're really conveying the information you were hoping to with that slide. Perhaps the slide just doesn't even need to be in there. And then, if you're in a more of a teaching format, maybe that's a little more like what this presentation is, where I'm trying to really have some more detailed takeaways along the way. And especially if I'm writing on the slides, doing any sort of derivation or anything like that, I start aiming for about 5 minutes per slide. So I want to go at a much more steady pace. And the goal is not to kind of, have as many slides as possible in my presentation, right? The goal is to have your audience leave with those 2 to 3 main messages in their mind. And I think if more slides does not necessarily achieve that purpose. Again, you've probably sat through presentations, or if you haven't yet, you will someday, or somebody had a 10-minute presentation and they brought 60 slides and they just blasted through them so fast that you didn't even, catch some of the messages on some of the slides. And I don't think that's a great strategy. So if I'm giving a 15-minute presentation, that's a pretty common presentation. 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes is a presentation that's for lots of class presentations or conference presentations. 15 minutes, I'll aim for kind of 12 to 15 slides, something like that, saying that some of my result slides I want to go a little more slowly, but maybe for my title slide and some of the background motivation slides, maybe I can go a little faster and more like a minute per slide. And then I would say, none of these are all rules of thumb. That's not the final rules. So I wouldn't just put together a 15-slide presentation and then show up cold to a presentation to give it. Rehearse it, try to talk it through in real time and see how you did compared to your time limit, and then adjust it. So I'd say, that should get you in the neighborhood, but you're not going to be guaranteed to be right spot on just because you followed these rules of thumb. Another general comment about these length is be really careful to stay to time in your presentation. Some people are tempted to kind of squeeze in an extra few minutes beyond what they were allotted. And I think it's really not respectful of your audience to take up more time than you were given in a session. You're kind of throwing off the schedule for other presentations or for other agenda items that were planned for that day. I also find that if I'm in a room listening to presentations and a speaker's going over length a lot, I start really getting distracted of like, is this person going to wrap up? Like, how much longer is this going for? Is the moderator of the session, are they going to be able to handle cutting off the speaker? And I quit listening to what they're saying, frankly. Not completely, but I certainly get distracted by the lack of sticking to time. And so just as both for your effectiveness and as a matter of courtesy, make sure you're staying on time relative to the time you've been allotted. A few other tips when you're putting together these slides. So I'd say try to write in complete sentences, but short sentences, right? So we don't want to write as if we're writing a novel or as if we're writing a paper. You can see all of this text here. These are all technically sentences, so they're not fragments, and that's much cleaner. So if I just write, for example, instead if I say write in short complete sentences, that stands alone as a reader of English. You can understand what I'm saying. If I had instead just written complete sentences, that would be much less clear what's going on, right? So we say, okay, complete sentences is an important thing. Is complete a verb now? Are you asking me to complete my sentences? Or are you saying that complete sentences are good, or are complete sentences bad? And so just leaving off a couple words can really, remove a lot of richness in the meaning of what you're trying to say. So try to use complete sentences, but not use excessive words. If you can make your title slides descriptive, that really helps a lot for the audience to understand kind of where you're going or what the point of that slide is. If your title slide is results, or if you have no title on the slide, it can be harder sometimes for the audience to understand what you're trying to get to. Be really careful about acronyms and jargon. So there's probably lots of acronyms you use in your work a lot, and they're very familiar to you, but your audience likely doesn't know them, even if they are expert. And jargon as well. There's, I'm sure, many terms of phrase in your work. Think hard about are your audience members going to understand that jargon? And I'd say when you're putting together your first draft, you don't need to worry about this, but make a note somewhere that after you get that draft done, go back through and try to strip out, if possible, strip out all the acronyms, strip out all the jargon, and it'll really help a lot with comprehension. In my companion presentation on figures, we'll get to that in more detail. I would also use animation really sparingly. It's tempting to kind of animate in the text line by line or animate in kind of each element that you're trying to talk about. I find it to be pretty distracting as an audience member. And that having kind of all this stuff moving along is annoying. Sometimes those animations take just a fraction of a second to come in, and it throws off the rhythm of the speaker. And so I don't find that to be very helpful. The converse is that you're going to have things up on the slide before you speak about them. So that's the case in this presentation. So I've had these 5 kind of bullet points sitting up here for the last couple minutes, and I'm sure you read ahead of me. So there is a risk there that you're reading something that's unrelated to what I'm speaking about. But I tend to find that risk is preferable to the risk of kind of distraction or delay due to excessive animations coming in. If you have a really complicated idea, sometimes animating things in can be okay, but I don't like to use it very frequently, certainly not on every slide. I think that's just distracting. And then also be careful with bullet point lists. So there's a few slides in this presentation where I violated that. You probably can sense just by looking at this slide here, this is not a very interesting slide visually. There's lots of text here that, some of it I started talking about several minutes ago, and I didn't get to this last one until just now. So the kind of the timing of things and the conveying of information is not great. So as a general rule, I like to try to stay away from bullet point lists in a presentation. In this case, because I'm trying to get you a set of rules and guidelines, and I hope that some of you can kind of take this exact list and check it against your presentations, I felt like it was worth the risk. But that's kind of a specific case, and as a general rule, I like to not have slides that look like this, that just have lists of text. Another practical item is that you want to use what we sometimes call effective redundancy. So I want to have redundancy in my messaging. And if there's key messages, a conclusion or a really innovative idea that I came up with in my research or innovative technique, I want to make sure that the audience gets that. And if I don't tell it to them in more than one way, there's a risk they might miss it. So generally, you can think about figures, equations, texts, and then what you're saying, all as ways of conveying information. And if there's something important, you want to give the audience kind of multiple chances to get it, right? And so I want to say something as well as have it on the screen in text, or I want to have some results in a figure, maybe some text accompanying it to say what's important about the figure, and then say it. And then I also want to say it multiple times, right? So if there's a key point, I might say it up front in the motivation, I might talk about it in my results, and then I might bring it back in the conclusions as well. Right, and so don't make a risk that if your audience member is not great at listening to English, but maybe they're better at reading English, that give them a chance to still get your message. It's natural that your audience is going to lose concentration for a few seconds here and there. If they lose concentration right at the few seconds where you were saying a key point, make sure there's other times in the presentation for them to hear that key point, in the motivation or the conclusions, even if they lost concentration for a few seconds during your results. Okay, so let's start wrapping this up. So we talked about kind of the structure of presentations and putting presentations together, and then some practical tips too. All right, and I would say that the message here, what I hope you're taking away from this, is that there's a few simple strategies you can use that'll really make your presentations more effective. I think if you follow the advice in here, you're more likely to connect with your audience. Your audience is more likely to process the key messages that you want them to leave with. And your audience is more likely to find you credible if you put together a structured and thoughtful presentation. And these are simple strategies, right? So I didn't do anything super complicated here that required weeks and weeks of presentation or required special software or anything like that. These are relatively straightforward, basic ideas. Another thing that I like to use in making this point is it's not just about, oh, you're doing a better job with the presentation, but it's a lot of work. It can actually be faster to produce a good presentation than a bad one, right? Because I've seen it be the case where somebody just takes this huge stack of results that they've collected up over, weeks or months or years, and they just put every result they have into a slide deck, and then they start trying to shuffle this stuff around to make a presentation. And you end up kind of having to really fight against your material to get it to fit, and you end up having to kind of shoehorn in results that maybe don't match your message. And if you really start from your conclusions and start from your message and work backward, you can be much more efficient in kind of getting the key results into the presentation and coming up with a set of material that's kind of coherent and effective. And so I think it can sometimes be faster to do a good job than to do a bad job. And the things that there's lots of logistical items in here that might require kind of thinking about a couple times through before it becomes instinctual to you. But I think a couple instinctual things that I would really encourage you to think on is always keep your conclusions in mind, right? What are you trying to tell the audience? What do you want the audience to leave knowing? And if you've always got that in mind, you can put that filter on the results and put the filter on the content that you're putting into your presentation and make sure that that's really shining through. And the second thing is just audience. Just always be thinking about your audience. Be imagining those people sitting in front of you. Right now, as I'm recording this, I'm imagining people out there listening and trying to think through what they would be interested in or how much detail I should provide on particular topics. And the more you can keep that audience's perspective in mind, the more likely you are to reach them and not risk one of these issues where they misunderstood something you were saying because you didn't provide enough background, or you used some sort of jargon that wasn't familiar to them, and so then they lost the point you were trying to make. And then finally, this is just some pretty basic ideas here. If you want to see additional details, there's all sorts of online resources out there about giving technical presentations, and so just web searches can find lots. There's a couple URLs here of some people who put up really nice thoughts on giving presentations that I found useful. You'll see similar ideas to some of the things I presented here, but you'll also see additional items. So if you're ready to try some other things, here's a couple URLs to get you started with additional refinement. So with that, let's start wrapping up. I hope there were some good takeaways here for you. Number one, I really hope you got got my message that thinking about the audience is important, and that you got some practical, effective strategies for putting together these presentations in a systematic manner. And then, in addition to that, there was lots of little, practical details and things about formatting slides and putting things together. And if you got some useful things out of that as well, I'll be appreciative of it. And I hope that somewhere out in the world, in the near future or the distant future, I'll be hearing your presentations. And as an audience member, I'll be benefiting from the thought and effectiveness that you've put into your presentation preparation. So good luck with those presentations, and stay tuned for part 2 of this to hear some details about putting together technical figures.